Welcome to my channel. Wolfland, learn English through stories. Please, like and subscribe.
Series of stories based on the novel The Mayor of Casterbridge by Thomas Hardy. Man of Character. Chapter 23. A conjecture that her visitor might be some other person had, indeed, flashed through Lucetta's mind when she was on the point of bursting out, but it was just too late to recede. He was years younger than the Mayor of Casterbridge, fair, fresh, and slenderly handsome. He wore genteel cloth leggings with white buttons, polished boots with infinite lace holes, light cord breeches under a black velveteen coat and waistcoat, and he had a silver-topped switch in his hand. Lucetta blushed, and said with a curious mixture of pout and laugh on her face, "Oh, I've made a mistake." The visitor, on the contrary, did not laugh half a wrinkle. "But I'm very sorry," he said, in deprecating tones. "I came and I inquired for Miss Henchard, and they showed me up here, and in no case would I have caught ye so unmannerly if I had known." "I was the unmannerly one," she said. "But is it that I have come to the wrong house, madam?" said Mr. Farfrae, blinking a little in his bewilderment, and nervously tapping his legging with his switch. "Oh no, sir, sit down." "You must come and sit down now you are here," replied Lucetta kindly, to relieve his embarrassment. "Miss Henchard will be here directly." Now this was not strictly true, but that something about the young man, that Hyperborean crispness, stringency, and charm, as of a well-braced musical instrument, which had awakened the interest of Henchard, and of Elizabeth Jane and of the three mariners' jovial crew, at sight, made his unexpected presence here attractive to Lucetta. He hesitated, looked at the chair, thought there was no danger in it, and sat down. Farfrae's sudden entry was simply the result of Henchard's permission to him to see Elizabeth if he were minded to woo her. At first he had taken no notice of Henchard's brusque letter, but an exceptionally fortunate business transaction put him on good terms with everybody, and revealed to him that he could undeniably marry if he chose. Then who so pleasing, thrifty, and satisfactory in every way as Elizabeth Jane? Apart from her personal recommendations, a reconciliation with his former friend Henchard would, in the natural course of things, flow from such a union. He therefore forgave the mayor his curtness, and this morning on his way to the fair he had called at her house, where he learnt that she was staying at Miss Templeman's. A little stimulated at not finding her ready and waiting, so fanciful are men, he hastened on to High Place Hall to encounter no Elizabeth but its mistress herself. "The fair today seems a large one," she said when, by natural deviation, their eyes sought the busy scene without. "Your numerous fairs and markets keep me interested. How many things I think of while I watch from here." He seemed in doubt how to answer, and the babble without reached them as they sat, voices as of wavelets on a looping sea, one ever and anon rising above the rest. "Do you look out often?" he asked. "Yes, very often." "Do you look for anyone you know?" Why should she have answered as she did? "I look as at a picture merely. But," she went on, turning pleasantly to him, "I may do so now, I may look for you. You are always there, are you not? Ah, I don't mean it seriously. But it is amusing to look for somebody one knows in a crowd, even if one does not want him. It takes off the terrible oppressiveness of being surrounded by a throng, and having no point of junction with it through a single individual. Maybe you'll be very lonely, ma'am? Nobody knows how lonely. But you are rich, they say? If so, I don't know how to enjoy my riches. I came to Casterbridge thinking I should like to live here. But I wonder if I shall. Where did you come from, ma'am?" "The neighborhood of Bath." "And I from near Edinburgh," he murmured. "It's better to stay at home, and that's true, but a man must live where his money is made. It is a great pity, but it's always so. Yet I've done very well this year." "Oh yes," he went on with ingenuous enthusiasm. You see that man with the drab kerseymere coat? I bought largely of him in the autumn when wheat was down, and then afterwards when it rose a little I sold off all I had. It brought only a small profit to me, while the farmers kept theirs, expecting higher figures, yes, though the rats were gnawing the ricks hollow. Just when I sold the markets went lower, and I bought up the corn of those who had been holding back at less price than my first purchases. And then, cried Farfree impetuously, his face alight, I sold it a few weeks after, when it happened to go up again. And so, by contenting Missile with small profits frequently repeated, I soon made £500, yes, while the others by keeping theirs in hand made nothing at all. Lucetta regarded him with a critical interest. He was quite a new type of person to her. At last his eye fell upon the ladies and their glances met. Now I'm wearying you," he exclaimed. She said, "No, indeed," coloring a shade. "What then?" "Quite otherwise. You are most interesting." It was now Farfree who showed the modest pink. "I mean all you Scotchmen," she added in hasty correction. "So free from southern extremes. We common people are all one way or the other, warm or cold, passionate or frigid. You have both temperatures going on in you at the same time." "But how do you mean that?" "You were best to explain clearly, ma'am. You are animated, then you are thinking of getting on. You are sad the next moment, then you are thinking of Scotland and friends." "Yes. I think of home sometimes," he said simply. "So do I, as far as I can. But it was an old house where I was born, and they pulled it down for improvements, so I seem hardly to have any home to think of now." Lucetta did not add, as she might have done, that the house was in St. Helier, and not in Bath. "But the mountains, and the mists and the rocks, they are there. And don't they seem like home?" She shook her head. "They do to me, they do to me," he murmured. And his mind could be seen flying away northwards. Whether its origin were national or personal, it was quite true what Lucetta had said, that the curious double strands in Farfree's thread of life, the commercial and the romantic, were very distinct at times. Like the colors in a variegated cord, those contrasts could be seen intertwisted, yet not mingling. "You are wishing you were back again," she said. "Ah, no, ma'am," said Farfree, suddenly recalling himself. The fair without the windows was now raging thick and loud. It was the chief hiring fair of the year, and differed quite from the market of a few days earlier. In substance it was a whitey-brown crowd flecked with white, this being the body of laborers waiting for places. The long bonnets of the women, like wagon tilts, their cotton gowns and checked shawls, mixed with the carters' smock-frocks, for they, too, entered into the hiring. Among the rest, at the corner of the pavement, stood an old shepherd, who attracted the eyes of Lucetta and Farfree by his stillness. He was evidently a chastened man. The battle of life had been a sharp one with him, for, to begin with, he was a man of small frame. He was now so bowed by hard work and years that, approaching from behind, a person could hardly see his head. He had planted the stem of his crook in the gutter, and was resting upon the bow, which was polished to silver brightness by the long friction of his hands. He had quite forgotten where he was, and what he had come for, his eyes being bent on the ground. A little way off negotiations were proceeding which had reference to him, but he did not hear them, and there seemed to be passing through his mind pleasant visions of the hiring successes of his prime, when his skill laid open to him any farm for the asking. The negotiations were between a farmer from a distant county and the old man's son. In these there was a difficulty. The farmer would not take the crust without the crumb of the bargain, in other words, the old man without the younger, and the son had a sweetheart on his present farm, who stood by, waiting the issue with pale lips. "I'm sorry to leave ye, Nellie," said the young man with emotion. But you see, I can't starve father, and he's out o' work at Lady Day. 'Tis only 35 mile. The girl's lips quivered. 35 mile, she murmured. Ah, 'tis enough. I shall never see ye again. It was, indeed, a hopeless length of traction for Dan Cupid's magnet, for young men were young men at Casterbridge as elsewhere. Oh! No, no, I never shall, she insisted, when he pressed her hand, and she turned her face to Lucetta's wall to hide her weeping. The farmer said he would give the young man half an hour for his answer, and went away, leaving the group sorrowing. Lucetta's eyes, full of tears, met Farfree's. His, too, to her surprise, were moist at the scene. It is very hard, she said with strong feelings. Lovers ought not to be parted like that. Oh, if I had my wish, I'd let people live and love at their pleasure. Maybe I can manage that they'll not be parted, said Farfree. I want a young carter, and perhaps I'll take the old man too. Yes, he'll not be very expensive, and doubtless he will answer my purpose somehow. Oh, you are so good, she cried, delighted. Go and tell them, and let me know if you have succeeded. Farfree went out, and she saw him speak to the group. The eyes of all brightened. The bargain was soon struck. Farfree returned to her immediately it was concluded. It is kind-hearted of you, indeed, said Lucetta. For my part, I have resolved that all my servants shall have lovers if they want them. Do make the same resolve. Farfree looked more serious, waving his head a half-turn. I must be a little stricter than that, he said. Why? You are a thriving woman, and I am a struggling hand-corn merchant. I am a very ambitious woman. Ah, well, I cannot explain. I don't know how to talk to ladies, ambitious or no, and that's true, said Donald with grave regret. I try to be civil to a folk, no more. I see you are as you say, replied she, sensibly getting the upper hand in these exchanges of sentiment. Under this revelation of insight Farfree again looked out of the window into the thick of the fair. Two farmers met and shook hands, and being quite near the window their remarks could be heard as others had been. Have you seen young Mr. Farfree this morning? Asked one. He promised to meet me here at the stroke of 12, but I've gone athwart and about the fair half a dozen times, and never a sign of him, though he's mostly a man to his word. I quite forgot the engagement, murmured Farfree. Now you must go, said she. Must you not? Yes, he replied. But he still remained. You had better go, she urged. You will lose a customer. Now, Miss Templeman, you will make me angry, exclaimed Farfree. Then suppose you don't go, but stay a little longer? He looked anxiously at the farmer who was seeking him, and who just then ominously walked across to where Henchard was standing, and he looked into the room and at her. I like staying, but I fear I must go, he said. Business ought not to be neglected, ought it? Not for a single minute. It's true. I'll come another time, if I may, ma'am? Certainly, she said. What has happened to us today is very curious. Something to think over when we are alone, it's like to be. Oh, I don't know that. It is commonplace after all. No, I'll not say that. Oh no! Well, whatever it has been, it is now over, and the market calls you to be gone. Yes, yes. Market, business. I wish there were no business in the world. Lucetta almost laughed. She would quite have laughed, but that there was a little emotion going in her at the time. How you change, she said. You should not change like this. I have never wished such things before, said the Scotchman, with a simple, shamed, apologetic look for his weakness. It is only since coming here and seeing you. If that's the case, you had better not look at me any longer. Dear me, I feel I have quite demoralized you. But look or look not, I will see you in my thoughts. Well, I'll go, Thank you for the pleasure of this visit. Thank you for staying. Maybe I'll get into my market mind when I've been out a few minutes," he murmured. "But I don't know. As he went, she said eagerly, "You may hear them speak of me in Casterbridge as time goes on. If they tell you I'm a coquette, which some may, because of the incidents of my life, don't believe it, for I am not. I swear I will not," he said fervidly. Thus the two. She had enkindled the young man's enthusiasm till he was quite brimming with sentiment, while he, from merely affording her a new form of idleness, had gone on to wake her serious solicitude. Why was this? They could not have told. Lucetta as a young girl would hardly have looked at a tradesman. But her ups and downs, capped by her indiscretions with Henchard, had made her uncritical as to station. In her poverty she had met with repulse from the society to which she had belonged, and she had no great zest for renewing an attempt upon it now. Her heart longed for some ark into which it could fly and be at rest. Rough or smooth she did not care so long as it was warm. Farfree was shown out, it having entirely escaped him that he had called to see Elizabeth. Lucetta at the window watched him threading the maze of farmers and farmers' men. She could see by his gait that he was conscious of her eyes, and her heart went out to him for his modesty, pleaded with her sense of his unfitness that he might be allowed to come again. He entered the market-house, and she could see him no more. 3 minutes later, when she had left the window, knocks, not of multitude but of strength, sounded through the house, and the waiting maid tripped up. "The mayor," she said. Lucetta had reclined herself, and she was looking dreamily through her fingers. She did not answer at once, and the maid repeated the information with the addition, "And he's afraid he hasn't much time to spare, he says." "Oh. Then tell him that as I have a headache I won't detain him today." The message was taken down, and she heard the door close. Lucetta had come to Casterbridge to quicken Henchard's feelings with regard to her. She had quickened them, and now she was indifferent to the achievement. Her morning view of Elizabeth Jane as a disturbing element changed, and she no longer felt strongly the necessity of getting rid of the girl for her stepfather's sake. When the young woman came in, sweetly unconscious of the turn in the tide, Lucetta went up to her, and said quite sincerely, "I'm so glad you've come. You'll live with me a long time, won't you?" Elizabeth as a watchdog to keep her father off, what a new idea! Yet it was not unpleasing. Henchard had neglected her all these days, after compromising her indescribably in the past. The least he could have done when he found himself free, and herself affluent, would have been to respond heartily and promptly to her invitation. Her emotions rose, fell, undulated, filled her with wild surmise at their suddenness, and so passed Lucetta's experiences of that day. Chapter 24. Poor Elizabeth Jane, little thinking what her malignant star had done to blast the budding attentions she had won from Donald Farfree, was glad to hear Lucetta's words about remaining. For in addition to Lucetta's house being a home, that raking view of the marketplace which it afforded had as much attraction for her as for Lucetta. The Carrefour was like the regulation open place in spectacular dramas, where the incidents that occur always happen to bear on the lives of the adjoining residents. Farmers, merchants, dairymen, quacks, hawkers appeared there from week to week, and disappeared as the afternoon wasted away. It was the node of all orbits. From Saturday to Saturday was as from day to day with the two young women now. In an emotional sense they did not live at all during the intervals. Wherever they might go wandering on other days, on market day they were sure to be at home. Both stole sly glances out of the window at Farfree's shoulders and poll. His face they seldom saw, for, either through shyness, or not to disturb his mercantile mood, he avoided looking towards their quarters. Thus things went on, till a certain market morning brought a new sensation. Elizabeth and Lucetta were sitting at breakfast when a parcel containing 2 dresses arrived for the latter from London. She called Elizabeth from her breakfast, and entering her friend's bedroom, Elizabeth saw the gowns spread out on the bed, one of a deep cherry color, the other lighter, a glove lying at the end of each sleeve, a bonnet at the top of each neck, and parasols across the gloves, Lucetta standing beside the suggested human figure in an attitude of contemplation. "I wouldn't think so hard about it," said Elizabeth, marking the intensity with which Lucetta was alternating the question whether this or that would suit best. "But settling upon new clothes is so trying," said Lucetta. "You are that person," pointing to one of the arrangements. "Or you are that totally different person," pointing to the other. "For the whole of the coming spring, and one of the two, you don't know which, may turn out to be very objectionable." It was finally decided by Miss Templeman that she would be the cherry-colored person at all hazards. The dress was pronounced to be a fit, and Lucetta walked with it into the front room, Elizabeth following her. The morning was exceptionally bright for the time of year. The sun fell so flat on the houses and pavement opposite Lucetta's residence that they poured their brightness into her rooms. Suddenly, after a rumbling of wheels, there were added to this steady light a fantastic series of circling irradiations upon the ceiling, and the companions turned to the window. Immediately opposite, a vehicle of strange description had come to a standstill, as if it had been placed there for exhibition. It was the new-fashioned agricultural implement called a horse drill, till then unknown, in its modern shape, in this part of the country, where the venerable seedlip was still used for sowing as in the days of the Heptarchy. Its arrival created about as much sensation in the corn market as a flying machine would create at Charing Cross. The farmers crowded round it, women drew near it, children crept under and into it. The machine was painted in bright hues of green, yellow, and red, and it resembled as a whole a compound of hornet, grasshopper, and shrimp, magnified enormously. Or it might have been likened to an upright musical instrument with the front gone. That was how it struck Lucetta. "Why, it is a sort of agricultural piano," she said. "It has something to do with corn," said Elizabeth. "I wonder who thought of introducing it here?" Donald Farfree was in the minds of both as the innovator, for though not a farmer, he was closely leagued with farming operations. And as if in response to their thought, he came up at that moment, looked at the machine, walked round it, and handled it as if he knew something about its make. The 2 watchers had inwardly started at his coming, and Elizabeth left the window, went to the back of the room, and stood as if absorbed in the paneling of the wall. She hardly knew that she had done this till Lucetta, animated by the conjunction of her new attire with the sight of Farfree, spoke out. "Let us go and look at the instrument, whatever it is." Elizabeth Jane's bonnet and shawl were pitchforked on in a moment, and they went out. Among all the agriculturists gathered round, the only appropriate possessor of the new machine seemed to be Lucetta, because she alone rivaled it in color. They examined it curiously, observing the rows of trumpet-shaped tubes one within the other, the little scoops, like revolving salt spoons, which tossed the seed into the upper ends of the tubes that conducted it to the ground, till somebody said, "Good morning, Elizabeth Jane." She looked up, and there was her stepfather. His greeting had been somewhat dry and thunderous, and Elizabeth Jane, embarrassed out of her equanimity, stammered at random, "This is the lady I live with, father, Miss Templeman." Henchard put his hand to his hat, which he brought down with a great wave till it met his body at the knee. Miss Templeman bowed. "I am happy to become acquainted with you, Mr. Henchard," she said. "This is a curious machine." "Yes," Henchard replied, and he proceeded to explain it, and still more forcibly to ridicule it. "Who brought it here?" said Lucetta. "Oh, don't ask me, ma'am," said Henchard. "The thing, why 'tis impossible it should act." 'Twas brought here by one of our machinists on the recommendation of a jumped-up jackanapes of a fellow who thinks. His eye caught Elizabeth Jane's imploring face, and he stopped, probably thinking that the suit might be progressing. He turned to go away. Then something seemed to occur which his stepdaughter fancied must really be a hallucination of hers. A murmur apparently came from Henchard's lips in which she detected the words, "You refuse to see me," reproachfully addressed to Lucetta. She could not believe that they had been uttered by her stepfather, unless, indeed, they might have been spoken to one of the yellow-gaitered farmers near them. Yet Lucetta seemed silent, and then all thought of the incident was dissipated by the humming of a song, which sounded as though from the interior of the machine. Henchard had by this time vanished into the market-house, and both the women glanced towards the corn-drill. They could see behind it the bent back of a man who was pushing his head into the internal works to master their simple secrets. The hummed song went on. Elizabeth Jane had apprehended the singer in a moment, and looked guilty of she did not know what. Lucetta next recognized him, and more mistress of herself said archly, "The lass of Gowrie from inside of a seed drill! What a phenomenon!" Satisfied at last with his investigation, the young man stood upright, and met their eyes across the summit. "We are looking at the wonderful new drill," Miss Templeman said. "But practically it is a stupid thing, is it not?" she added on the strength of Henchard's information. "Stupid? Oh no," said Farfree gravely. "It will revolutionize sowing hereabout. No more sowers flinging their seed about broadcast, so that some falls by the wayside and some among thorns, and all that. Each grain will go straight to its intended place, and nowhere else whatever. Then the romance of the sower is gone for good," observed Elizabeth Jane, who felt herself at one with Farfree in Bible reading at least. "He that observeth the wind shall not sow, so the preacher said, but his words will not be to the point any more. How things change!" Aye, it must be so," Donald admitted, his gaze fixing itself on a blank point far away. "But the machines are already very common in the east and north of England," he added apologetically. Lucetta seemed to be outside this train of sentiment, her acquaintance with the scriptures being somewhat limited. "Is the machine yours?" she asked of Farfree. "Oh no, madam," said he, becoming embarrassed and deferential at the sound of her voice, though with Elizabeth Jane he was quite at his ease. No, I merely recommended that it should be got." In the silence which followed, Farfree appeared only conscious of her, to have passed from perception of Elizabeth into a brighter sphere of existence than she appertained to. Lucetta, discerning that he was much mixed that day, partly in his mercantile mood and partly in his romantic one, said gaily to him, "Well, don't forsake the machine for us," and went indoors with her companion. The latter felt that she had been in the way, though why was unaccountable to her. Lucetta explained the matter somewhat by saying when they were again in the sitting-room, "I had occasion to speak to Mr. Farfree the other day, and so I knew him this morning." Lucetta was very kind towards Elizabeth that day. Together they saw the market thicken, and in course of time thin away with the slow decline of the sun towards the upper end of town, its rays taking the street-end ways and enfilading the long thoroughfare from top to bottom. The gigs and vans disappeared one by one till there was not a vehicle in the street. The time of the riding world was over, the pedestrian world held sway. Field laborers and their wives and children trooped in from the villages for their weekly shopping, and instead of a rattle of wheels and a tramp of horses ruling the sound as earlier, there was nothing but the shuffle of many feet. All the implements were gone, all the farmers, all the moneyed class. The character of the town's trading had changed from bulk to multiplicity, and pence were handled now as pounds had been handled earlier in the day. Lucetta and Elizabeth looked out upon this, for though it was night and the street lamps were lighted, they had kept their shutters unclosed. In the faint blink of the fire they spoke more freely. "Your father was distant with you," said Lucetta. "Yes." And having forgotten the momentary mystery of Henchard's seeming speech to Lucetta, she continued, "It is because he does not think I am respectable. I have tried to be so more than you can imagine, but in vain. My mother's separation from my father was unfortunate for me. You don't know what it is to have shadows like that upon your life." Lucetta seemed to wince. "I do not, of that kind precisely," she said. "But you may feel a sense of disgrace, shame, in other ways." "Have you ever had any such feeling?" said the younger innocently. "Oh no," said Lucetta quickly. "I was thinking of what happens sometimes when women get themselves in strange positions in the eyes of the world from no fault of their own. It must make them very unhappy afterwards. It makes them anxious, for might not other women despise them? Not altogether despise them, yet not quite like or respect them." Lucetta winced again. Her past was by no means secure from investigation, even in Casterbridge. For one thing, Henchard had never returned to her the cloud of letters she had written and sent him in her first excitement. Possibly they were destroyed, but she could have wished that they had never been written. The rencounter with Farfrae and his bearings towards Lucetta had made the reflective Elizabeth more observant of her brilliant and amiable companion. A few days afterwards, when her eyes met Lucetta's as the latter was going out, she somehow knew that Miss Templeman was nourishing a hope of seeing the attractive Scotchman. The fact was printed large all over Lucetta's cheeks and eyes to any one who could read her as Elizabeth Jane was beginning to do. Lucetta passed on and closed the street door. A seer's spirit took possession of Elizabeth, impelling her to sit down by the fire and divine events so surely from data already her own that they could be held as witnessed. She followed Lucetta thus mentally, saw her encounter Donald somewhere as if by chance, saw him wear his special look when meeting women, with an added intensity because this one was Lucetta. She depicted his impassioned manner, beheld the indecision of both between their loathness to separate and their desire not to be observed, depicted their shaking of hands, how they probably parted with frigidity in their general contour and movements, only in the smaller features showing the spark of passion, thus invisible to all but themselves. This discerning silent which had not done thinking of these things when Lucetta came noiselessly behind her and made her start. It was all true as she had pictured, she could have sworn it. Lucetta had a heightened luminousness in her eye over and above the advanced color of her cheeks. "You've seen Mr. Farfrae?" said Elizabeth demurely. "Yes," said Lucetta. "How did you know?" She knelt down on the hearth and took her friend's hands excitedly in her own. But after all she did not say when or how she had seen him, or what he had said. That night she became restless. In the morning she was feverish, and at breakfast time she told her companion that she had something on her mind, something which concerned a person in whom she was interested much. Elizabeth was earnest to listen and sympathize. "This person, a lady, once admired a man much, very much," she said tentatively. "Ah," said Elizabeth Jane. "They were intimate, rather. He did not think so deeply of her as she did of him. But in an impulsive moment, purely out of reparation, he proposed to make her his wife. She agreed. But there was an unsuspected hitch in the proceedings, though she had been so far compromised with him that she felt she could never belong to another man, as a pure matter of conscience, even if she should wish to. After that they were much apart, heard nothing of each other for a long time, and she felt her life quite closed up for her. Ah, poor girl! She suffered much on account of him, though I should add that he could not altogether be blamed for what had happened. At last the obstacle which separated them was providentially removed, and he came to marry her. How delightful! But in the interval she, my poor friend, had seen a man she liked better than him. Now comes the point, could she in honor dismiss the first? A new man she liked better, that's bad. Yes, said Lucetta, looking pained at a boy who was swinging the town pump handle. It is bad. Though you must remember that she was forced into an equivocal position with the first man by an accident, that he was not so well educated or refined as the second, and that she had discovered some qualities in the first that rendered him less desirable as a husband than she had at first thought him to be. I cannot answer, said Elizabeth Jane thoughtfully. It is so difficult. It wants a pope to settle that. You prefer not to, perhaps? Lucetta showed in her appealing tone how much she leant on Elizabeth's judgment. Yes, Miss Templeman, admitted Elizabeth. I would rather not say. Nevertheless, Lucetta seemed relieved by the simple fact of having opened out the situation a little, and was slowly convalescent of her headache. Bring me a looking-glass. How do I appear to people? She said languidly. Well, a little worn, answered Elizabeth, eyeing her as a critic eyes a doubtful painting. Fetching the glass, she enabled Lucetta to survey herself in it, which Lucetta anxiously did. I wonder if I wear well, as times go, she observed after a while. Yes, fairly. Where am I worst? Under your eyes, I notice a little brownness there. Yes. That is my worst place, I know. How many years more do you think I shall last before I get hopelessly plain? There was something curious in the way in which Elizabeth, though the younger, had come to play the part of experienced sage in these discussions. It may be 5 years, she said judicially. Or, with a quiet life, as many as 10. With no love you might calculate on 10. Lucetta seemed to reflect on this as on an unalterable, impartial verdict. She told Elizabeth Jane no more of the past attachment she had roughly adumbrated as the experiences of a third person, and Elizabeth, who in spite of her philosophy was very tender-hearted, sighed that night in bed at the thought that her pretty, rich Lucetta did not treat her to the full confidence of names and dates in her confessions. For by the she of Lucetta's story Elizabeth had not been beguiled.